Happy New Year's and welcome to another episode of my weekly standard meta review where I go over my favorite budget options for beginners, the best decks in best of 3, and then the best decks in best of 1. So this week we're going to start things off with the domain ramp list by Mogged. The same list by Herman Hero also did very well in the standard challenge. So Mogged took down first place on December 23rd, and then Herman Hero took down second place on December 24th. So the list does seem to be doing well in the current meta. And if we compare this to the version, the second version that I covered in week 3 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, there's a couple of changes, not too many. The first one is including the Wandering Emperor in the main. We've seen this as a sideboard option, and this time it's actually coming into the main. The Planeswalkers work really nicely against the other board wipes in the meta. So we've also got getting rid of the one copy of the Courier's Briefcase. We've kind of seen that one come and go. It works better to chump block and ramp you to like a Depopulate or a Sunfall if you're up against a lot of aggression. So with the Wandering Emperor in and the Courier's Briefcase out, you can kind of say like the meta's slowed down a little bit. And going up to 4 copies of Up the Beanstalk, because this is really good for outvaluing your opponent. Every time you cast a 5-cost spell, you're going to draw a card. And then we've got only 1 copy of the Depopulate, which is, I think, another sign that Mogged thought that the meta was slowing down and didn't need as much elimination of the go wide and early pressure strategies. And then we've got 1 copy of Vanquish the Horde, though. So if you are kind of going up against like the Boros Tokens deck and like the Azorius Soldiers is kind of board floody, Vanquish the Horde works really well as a cheap Wrath, because if your opponent gets up to like 6 creatures really quickly, then it's a 2-cost Wrath. So this one's kind of like an alternative to Depopulate, and that was kind of fun to see. And then gone down 1 copy of the Invasion of Zendikar, which we've seen kind of fluctuate between 2 and 4 copies, and it really depends on how much you're leaning into Topiary Stomper getting you to 4 mana, and then Invasion of Zendikar getting you to, well, playing a land and playing Invasion of Zendikar can turn it to 7, so you can immediately flip it with Topiary Stomper. But and then we've got a best of 3 sideboard, which were the same list between Herman Hero and Mogged. And we've got 2 copies of Lithomantic Barrage for if you're against white or blue. Negate if you're up against a heavy spell list. Chromehose Seed Shark if you need an alternative win condition. These pair very nicely with the Leyline binding, creating 6/6 incubator tokens. Another copy of Negate. 4 copies of Knockout Blow if you do end up against a mono-red deck. Temporary Lockdown for any of the early aggressive strategies, just a cheap Wrath, or it wipes the board for everything mana value 2 or less. And then 1 copy of the Obstinate Baloth, which is in here for... I hate how sometimes you can't show the last one. It's in there so that if you come up against a Liliana, anything that's making you discard Obstinate Baloth, if it gets discarded, you can play it for free. Next up on the list is Selesnya Enchantments by Island Go SA Me. So there's a Selesnya Enchantments for best of 1, and then there's a Selesnya Enchantments for best of 3. And the metas tend to be a little bit different. Best of 1 tends to have more aggro, whereas best of 3 tends to be a little bit slower. And so we've seen this best of 3 list before, all the way back in week 6 of Wilds of Eldraine. We've had a very, very small change to the list. And the list is running one overgrown farmland, an additional land, and taking out the 1 copy of the Virtue of Loyalty. Other than this, it's the exact same list, and it's got some similarities to what you're trying to do in Best of 1, but it's got some cards that kind of help you shift it more towards the mid-range. So like Rite of Harmony, whenever you cast a creature or an enchantment, you draw a card. But it's still got like the Jukai Naturalist, it still has the Ossification, still has a lot of what the core in Best of 1 is doing, but Restoration of Agonjo is something you see in Best of 3 and not in Best of 1. A very nice mid-range threat. The Hollowed Haunting as well is better the longer the game is going, the more likely that you're going to be able to eventually overrun your opponent. And we see less of the Audacity and Calyx kind of trying to destroy your opponent as quickly as possible. And we got some Seed of Hopes. This is one you've seen in the best of 3 list and not in the best of 1. And then 4 copies of Commune with Spirits instead of 1 as well. So the best of 3 sideboard, though, has got 2 Circle of Confinements, an additional Rite of Harmony, Catilda, if you want another copy of that, 3 copies of Knockout Blow for against Mono-Red, additional Get Lost if you need more interaction, the Stone Brain, which is kind of like the Pithing Needle or the End. Like if you're up against like Azorius Control and you need something to pinpoint, like get rid of all of your opponent's Wandering Emperors, for example, can make it really hard for the Azorius Control deck to seal out the game. And so this is good. The more centric, there's 1 key card that you want to get rid of. We've got 1 copy of the Wedding Announcement, which kind of interesting if you want additional resources for going wide. And then 2 copies of Vanquish the Horde if you're coming up against another deck that's going wider than you are. And bring this in, especially against like the Boros Tokens deck. 3rd place on December 23rd went to Azorius Aggro by MJ_23. And they have been playing Azorius Aggro for many, many weeks, so I'm glad to see them finally get into the top 3. And this list has been kind of sometimes called Azorius Tokens, or earlier Azorius Midrange is what I called it during week 3 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And there's been a couple of tweaks to the list that I think makes it a little bit more aggro, a little bit less mid-rangey. So we're down 1 copy of Skrelv, no copy of Skrelv, up 2 copies of the Warden of the Inner Sky, no copy of Malcolm, Alluring Scoundrel, and we've got 2 copies of the Tishana's Tidebinder. And this one has been surprisingly good. So if you're hitting against like in the mirror match, you can eliminate your opponent's schooner and just make it into an artifact that just sits dead on the board. You can hit Adeline and make it into just a 0/4 that does nothing. You can eliminate Shieldred and make Shieldred just into a 4/5 that doesn't have Death Touch or the draw triggers. There's a lot of good targets for Tishana's Tidebinder, and so I'm happy to see this one in the main. And we're tweaking a little bit away from, so like we're down the 2 copies of Destroy Evil and down the 1 copy of Make Disappear, and leaning more heavily into Get Lost. So we've got 4 copies of Get Lost, and then down 1 copy of, up 2 copies of Protect the Negotiators, which is kind of like the Make Disappear, but allows you to pay white to create a 1/1, and then you counter target spell for each creature you control. They have to pay 1 colorless. And most notably, what I found the most surprising about this list is that they decided to cut the 4 copies of Wedding Announcement. So between the Invasion of Segovia and the Virtue of Loyalty and your various things that can spam, Wandering Emperor can put tokens onto the board. I guess it was just determined that Wedding Announcement wasn't working particularly well. So I thought that was an interesting change. And then they went down 1 planes, otherwise kept the lands the same. And the best of 3 sideboards got 2 Spell Pierce. Some people like to run Spell Pierce, some people like to run Negate, for if you come up against like Azorius Control, something that's very spell heavy. We've got Lantern Flare, which deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life. And where X is the number of creatures you control. You don't have the red, so you're not going to cleave it. But since you're going wide, this can be a lot of direct damage and life gain. And the life gain can be particularly useful if you're up against another aggro deck. We do have the copies of Wedding Announcement in the sideboard if it turns out to be a favorable match where you can bring in the Wedding Announcement. Generally, Wedding Announcement does poorly the more aggressive the meta is. So if the meta is slower, I would expect Wedding Announcement to do better. Because it does help you get that kind of late game value, the drawing the cards or creating the tokens to go wide. And then we've got the 3rd copy of Tishana's Tidebinder, 3 copies of Disdainful Stroke, which is particularly nice if you're coming up against like Sunfalls. This is a pretty good counter to that. Another copy of Protect the Negotiators, if you need more counter spells. Dinnick Pious Apprentice, if they're this is a good one to bring in if you're getting it pressured early because of the lifelink. And then there aren't too many reanimator strategies right now in the meta, so Dinnick doesn't... The cards in graveyards can't be the target of spells or abilities. Can be relevant, although I expect it to be very rare that it is relevant. And then we've got Knockout Blow, which some targeted hate if you're up against Mono-Red, for example. So first place on December 24th was taken down by a Mono-Red Aggro deck by Mercies. And if we compare this to week 4 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, it's down 1 copy of Charming Scoundrel, up 1 additional copy of Mishra's Foundry, which is the colorless land that turns into a 2/2, and it has the same best of 3 sideboard. So if you want that, you can look at these decks that I cover each week. If you don't want to go back and look through the videos, you can always look me up on AetherHub and go through the decks, and you can there's a way to look up each one. So you can look up the Mono-Red Aggro deck from week 4 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan. I just can't cover it every single week if it's only like 1 card that's been changed, right? So this week we've got some good changes to Esper Midrange by Cigarettes After Shrek, which wins the title of the best username in Magic the Gathering Arena. And so this was 3rd place on December 24th. And if we compare this to the week 6 list on Lost Caverns of Ixalan, there's been a couple of changes, leaning a little bit more heavily into white and tweaking the lands to reflect that. So we're down 1 copy of the Lauren of the Third Path, down the 3 copies of Lord Skitter, the Sewer King, and in their place we're playing the Preacher of the Schism, which is a new card from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan that creates 1/1 vampire tokens with lifelink, or draws you a card and you lose 1 life, and it does both if your opponent's life total is the same as yours. And then we've got Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, which works really well with the Deep Cavern Bat and the early flyers like Fairy Mastermind. The more evasion that you have, the more likely that you'll be able to deal damage to your opponent and then pay 1 life to draw a card. And then if you are drawing cards, if you have Shieldred in play, you gain 2 life. So Gix doesn't even hurt us, it actually gains us life to have that. Also combines nicely with Urtai Resurrected, where if you counter a target or destroy a target creature your opponent controls, and then they draw a card. And if they're drawing a card, then they're taking damage from Shieldred. There's some nice synergies there. They decided to cut the 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder, which we'd seen in some lists, as well as go down 1 copy of Cut Down to go up 2 copies of Destroy Evil, which works really well against Esper Midrange lists that are running the Wedding Announcement and the Virtue of Loyalty. Down 1 Go for the Throat, and up 3 copies of Make Disappear. So Cavern of Souls be damned, just going to go straight into 4 copies of Make Disappear, which still works. Cavern of Souls just prevents tribal decks from being countered for their creature spells, but like non-creature spells, Make Disappear still works very well. And then we've got down 1 copy of Spell Pierce, up 2 copies of A Darker Waste, and deciding to run a Gonjo in the main, which are both kind of a reflection of there just being more white in the main board. Oh, I guess sorry, I misspoke. This one isn't running a Gonjo. For some reason, I thought it was running a Gonjo. But yeah, basically like tweaking like the Rafine's Tower down, Shattered Sanctum, etc. to reflect the changes in the main. Like there's no Takanuma, right? Okay, yeah, no Takanuma, which is the black version of Otawara and a Gonjo. And then the best of 3 sideboard, we've got 1 copy of Negate, Anoint with Affliction, the 3 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder. So instead of having this in the main, deciding to bring this in from the sideboard, if there is a good target that you see in the game, then you can bring these in. We've got 2 copies of Gix's Command, which is really great for wrathing your opponent's board or giving you lifelink. We've got 2 additional copies of Cut Down, 2 more copies of Destroy Evil, 2 Disdainful Strokes, the 2nd copy of Lauren of the Third Path, and then, curiously, and I'm so sad I can't show you guys the very last card. There it goes. Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, which is the mythic bat god from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And this one's just a really good recurring threat if your opponent doesn't have any exile. Because you get a 4/4 flying lifelink that when it dies, turns into the land, and then you can transform it back into the Bat God if you or your opponent has one or fewer cards in hand. And I also like to cover best of one lists. Don't worry if best of one is your jam. Always cover some best of one lists. And the number one top performing deck on Untapped was Mono White Humans. And this was the I was kind of surprised by this. This was the same list as the one that I covered in last week in week 6. The second version that was the kind of speculative pick that was running Brushlands in the mono white, so the green-white Painland for Kellen. That one is now performing above 1,000 matches and has the highest win rate of that criteria. So if you want, last week, go look at that one. The speculative pick is the top performing one in best of one. And in number 2, though, we've got Mono-Red Aggro. And if we compare this to last week's list, we see a couple of tweaks. So we've got one copy of Shivan Devastator, which pairs nicely with Godric Cloaked Reveler, because as long as you triggered Celebration, you can tap 1 red to give dragons you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So this you can get an additional pump of the Shivan Devastator. It's kind of a fun one. And then we've got we're back on to the 4 copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary. Momentarily, we saw this dip out, and so we're back to 4 copies here. Down 2 copies of the Charming Scoundrel, which these are kind of interchangeable. So this I think it's better if you are gonna get to 5 mana, which doesn't happen all too that often in best of one. And it's worse at triggering the Celebration off of Godric. So it's a little bit less of a Godric-centric plan, but that makes sense because they've dropped 1 copy of Godric down from 4 to 3. And then also dropped 1 copy of Squee down, which I thought was kind of an interesting choice. And we're back up to 4 copies of Monstrous Rage. And then in the lands, we've decided to go down to 20. So this is an ultra low land count, dropping the 2 Mishra's Foundries, but not replacing them with mountains, just going for 20 lands. Number 3 was Selesnya Enchantments, and if I compare this one to the list I covered in Lost Caverns of Ixalan on week 2, it's basically the same deck, except for they've tweaked the lands even further. So they're down the 4 copies of the Brushland, down 2 copies of the Razorverge Thicket, and down 1 copy of the Overgrown Farmland. So only 1 copy of Overgrown Farmland, and only 2 copies of the Razorverge Thicket. And instead, they're going up 3 plains and up 4 forests. So just running more basic lands, which should be good for those who are on a budget. It means that Selesnya Enchantments works pretty well without a bunch of rare lands. Number 4 was the Selesnya Enchantments deck. So number 3 was in Selesnya Enchantments. Number 4 was Selesnya Enchantments. Is the same exact list, rare lands included, as I covered in week 2. And then number 5 was a Mono-Red Burn list, which was the same as the list I covered in week 3. And number 6, though, we start to see something new. So we've got Domain specifically for a best of 1. And this one's taking a little bit more of an alternative approach. So if I compare this to the best of 1 list that I covered in week 3, we can see a couple of changes. So down 1 Atraxa to a total of 2, and up 1 Atali. And this kind of reminds me of like the older version of this. So when we saw like Atali and Breach the Multiverse, Domain ramp was kind of going that route, and then we saw that kind of get phased out for the Domain versions that we've been covering for the last month or 2. And so this is kind of like a throwback. It's kind of fun to see. So yeah, no courier briefcase, no copies of Go for the Throat. So just getting rid of the spot removal, leaning more heavily on the Wrath. And then 2 copies of Up the Beanstalks, and we're leaning more heavily into just outvaluing the opponent. 2 copies of Invasion of Zendikar from 2 to 4. And no copies of Depopulate. So like leaning more heavily on the Wrath, but also having fewer Wraths. And no copies of Virtue of Persistence, which is the black -3/-3 and gain 2 life, or bring something back from your graveyard into play. And instead, we're running 2 copies of Jace, the Perfected Mind, which I thought was kind of interesting. In the mirror match, the Domain mirror match tends to be kind of the downside of playing Domain. They're really, really grindy matches, and so Jace is an interesting way to catch your opponent off guard, because with Breach the Multiverse, you can get a mill win, especially in the mirror match. So, just kind of an alternative way to approach the Domain best of one deck. All right, number 7 was Azorius Soldiers, and if I compare this to the list I covered in week 1 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, I was kind of speculating on what the Soldiers deck would look like as we went further into the meta, and I was wrong. It leaned, we're now at week 7 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, so I think that this is getting close to. We're going to have one more month of the meta slowly evolving before we get a change in early February with the murders at Karlov Manor. So, but this is the one that's been performing the best according to Untapped, and this one's the more creature-centric version of Azorius Soldiers. Notably, no Lunarch Veteran, which I thought was going to be useful against the Mono-Red, but I guess this is leaning more heavily into soldier synergies, and Lunarch Veteran is not a soldier. So no copies there, and we're up 4 copies of the Frontliner, fully going into the soldier synergies. 4 copies of Thalia, which we saw kind of get phased out for momentarily for the Azorius Flash Soldiers, because it was running Make Disappear or Protect the Negotiators, and kind of leaning more into the Zephyr Sentinel and being able to hold up mana. And so this one is just we're running just creatures. There's no there's no spells in this list, so Thalia is definitely going to make it in. We've got 3 copies of Harbin because, like I said, we're leaning fully into the soldier synergies, not including alternative things like Lunarch Veteran, so Harbin becomes better. No copies of Malcolm, Alluring Scoundrel, that just the soldier synergies turned out to be better than the Flash Flyers. Zephyr Sentinel, the same thing with the Flash Flyer. Although it is a soldier, you've just got better statted soldiers that you can play if you don't care about the Flash. You don't want to keep the mana up. Down 4 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist, which was the 3 rectangles in 1 with Battle Cry that spawns 1/1 bats. And so that one's out because it's not a soldier. And then also down 4 copies of Knight Errant of Eos, which I kind of like. That one is problematic against Mono-Red specifically. So you don't have the Lunarch Veterans, but then you don't have the Knight Errant of Eos, right? Up 4 copies of Brutal Cathar, up 4 copies of the Siege Veteran, and up 4 copies of the Skystrike Officer, and 1 copy of Myral Shield of Argive. So, and no Make Disappears, no Wedding Announcements. So that's more of more. I thought maybe we would see more like we were seeing in Best of 3 at the end of Wilds of Eldraine, and the soldier centric creature forward one appears to be the superior list, and yeah, this is it. And then last week, because I was it's always a dilemma when you're doing a weekly meta review to try to keep it here are the best decks, but not just here are the same best 3 decks every single week, right? So sometimes I like to open up the criteria for how good a deck is, right? And kind of like the mono white list that was number 1 this week was a speculative pick. So I'm going to start, especially near the end of the sets, going to start including a little bit more of these speculative low matches, just to see kind of like an alternative idea that might do better than the current one with the higher amount of matches. But so this week's speculative pick will be the Mono-Red Aggro list. And this one's dropping 2 Phoenix Chicks, as well as 1 copy of Godric, down from 4 to 3, for 3 copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary, which is similar to the the number 2 performing list. The Bloodthirsty Adversaries are back, and so because the Bloodthirsty Adversaries are back, we're gonna be leaning on Nahiri's Warcrafting instead of the Witchstalker's Frenzy. And I like this change, right? I think that if you're gonna play the Bloodthirsty Adversaries, then you should play the Nahiri's Warcrafting. If you're gonna get rid of the Bloodthirsty Adversaries, then you should play the Witchstalker Frenzy. But the reason why it's nice is because it's 3 or less for something to come back with Bloodthirsty Adversary, and Nahiri's Warcrafting costs 3 or less and helps you dig to additional stuff. So if you are ever hitting 5 lands, then you can afford to bring back your Warcrafting, and then Warcrafting is especially good in that situation where you're hitting 5 lands and need to dig to additional gas. Down 1 copy of Sokenzan, Crucible of Defiance. Some lists run 2 legendary lands, some not. And this one's not messing around with going ultra low in lands. This one's got 22 lands, so we can afford to take play some colorless lands with the Mishra's Foundry, which helps us beat the the control decks. So, and yeah, not going down a land for the Sokenzan, so up 1 mountain. Anyway, whew, what a list, man, and what a year. This has been an absolute joy. I just want to say thank you to everybody who's recently found me and has helped me establish this beautiful community that I have here on YouTube and on Twitch and on Discord. And 2023 has been an amazing year, and I hope that 2024 just continues to bring more wonderful surprises. So remember to hit like and subscribe to help support me, and I'll be back next week to continue to give these meta reviews. Remember to leave a comment to help boost the algorithm and let me know that I'm doing a good job and all that, and you're finding it useful. It makes me feel good, so I appreciate it. And maybe I'll see you on the ladder. Have a wonderful new year, and I'll see you next week.